Reform will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare a recess at any time. This morning, the Government Accountability Office released its 8th annual report on opportunities for the federal government to reduce duplication, overlap, and fragmentation, and to achieve other financial benefits. Over the course of 8 years, the GAO has highlighted more than 300 areas of such waste and inefficiency in the federal government and recommended nearly 800 corrective actions. I first want to thank you, Mr. Dodaro, as well as your entire staff, for the excellent work that they do. This report provides the opportunity to highlight duplication and inefficiency throughout the government. Many of the issues we will discuss today will lay the groundwork for future hearings and legislative action. The federal government will save an estimated $125 billion by 2025 based on implementation of GAO recommendations to date. Through congressional action and actions by executive agencies, 52% of GAO's recommended corrective actions have been fully addressed and closed, but that does leave 48. The GAO's annual report shows us persistent effort to address inefficiencies and resolve wasteful spending can collectively provide a significant benefit to the public. 52% of actions addressed is a good start, but the other 48% need to be done. We could save billions more by taking action at just 3 agencies: the Department of Defense, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Through GAO's annual reports, more than half of all corrective actions have been directed at these 3 agencies. Yet, all 3 have more than 40% of recommended actions still open. For example, GAO estimates Department of Defense could save more than $9 billion by identifying opportunities for consolidating or reducing the size of headquarters organizations. GAO also found that the IRS could save billions in fraudulent refunds by improving efforts to prevent fraud associated with identity theft. GAO has recommended the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services take steps to improve the accuracy in diagnostic coding practices for Medicare Advantage payments, which could result in savings of billions of dollars. GAO does find in this year's report the IRS has had some success in reducing millions of dollars of fraud by simply delaying the date for sending refunds while it verifies critical information. The committee would be interested in hearing more about this particular effort. The federal government has an obligation to taxpayers to avoid fragmentation and ensure effective program coordination across agencies. Disagreements over policy might lead to disagreements over appropriate spending, but wasting tax dollars because of a failure to coordinate is simply unacceptable. For example, GAO's newly released report shows the Department of Agriculture has an entire seafood inspection program to ensure the safety of domestic and imported catfish, while the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for the safety of all other seafood. Having a separate inspection program for one species of fish is an example of inefficiency we hope is an outlier. But if we are going to have this type of fragmented seafood inspection system, we expect close coordination at a minimum between the 2 agencies involved. Unfortunately, the GAO has found the 2 agencies are not coordinating well. In fact, do not even have common standards for public safety of the fish they inspect. All federal workers must embrace their role as fiduciaries for the American public. Everyone should consider it part of their job description to avoid waste and ensure tax dollars are being used effectively. GAO's annual report provides an important roadmap to tackling known waste and inefficiency. We know there is only so much GAO can do. It is up to agencies to take your recommendations to heart and to act on them. And it is up to us in Congress to act in many cases. But as we will hear, agencies need to take action more rapidly. In some cases, the solution to reducing overlap may be evident, but Practical or political challenges may be an impediment. In other cases, an agency or Congress may lack basic information about whether a program is functioning as intended, and simply obtaining better data is a critical first step. We look forward to discussing why recommendations remain open for so long and what this committee can do to help the agencies gain greater efficiencies and avoid wasting tax dollars. I look forward to hearing from the Comptroller General today on ways to reduce wasteful spending where it has been identified, as well as areas where agencies can take steps to avoid spending in duplicative ways in the future. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by indicating my appreciation for this very critical hearing. And I certainly want to thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for being here yet again to testify about what is now your 8th annual report on this very important issue. We sit here every year in the committee, as the committee holds this hearing, outlining the programs and the progress and the challenges we have. Now, there have been, interestingly, different chairs, and I suppose you haven't seen Mr. Russell and me, since we're imposters for the moment, sitting in for the chair and the ranking member. But you get the point that there have been, with each of your reports, different chairs, Mr. Issa, Mr. Chaffetz, Mr. Gowdy is now the chair, and there may be someone new. In fact, Mr. Gowdy is leaving the Congress, so there will be yet another chair. But isn't it important to note that we are always partners in these hearings? One constant we have noticed over these years is that the executive branch can certainly do better. I say this regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who is president, and regardless of which political party she belongs to. I'm sure my Republican colleagues would agree. However, in order to truly address these recommendations, we not only need a sustained commitment by the agencies involved, we also need sustained oversight from our own committee. Congress needs to follow up on these recommendations to ensure that the reforms are made. That is why today's hearing is so important. For example, the Department of Defense is the largest agency in the federal government by far. It is probably the largest agency in the history of the world. We need it to be successful because it defends the country, our people, and our freedom. But the Department of Defense wastes a phenomenal amount of money. Every dollar that is squandered is a dollar that could be gone to help protect our troops, our service members who risk life and limb to protect us every single day. To be clear, there has been progress. In 2011, when GAO issued its first duplication report, it recommended several steps to improve the way the Department of Defense develops and acquires weapons systems. The Pentagon implemented several of these recommendations, and according to the GAO, saved approximately $16 billion from 2011 to 2015. That is a terrific example of how the process is supposed to work. Unfortunately, there are dozens of areas in which the Department of Defense could do much better. This year, GAO's report says the Department of Defense still has 74 recommendations that remain open, some of them dating back to 2011. For example, the GAO made several recommendations for the Department of Defense to manage its commissaries more efficiently and reduce the size and staffing at various headquarters. Now I understand that these may not be the most exciting issues, and they may not get headlines, but GAO reports that the Department of Defense fully implemented these recommendations. If the Department of Defense fully administered these recommendations, they could save the American taxpayers $11 billion. to me, if our committee played even a small role in achieving these savings, that could be something we could be proud of, because $11 billion is a lot of money. For these reasons, I would like to make a modest proposal, Mr. Chairman. After today's hearing, I propose that our committee hold a follow-up hearing with the Department of Defense. Let's work with the department officials to determine what they are in fact doing to address these issues, and what more can be done to allow them to operate more efficiently and save more, like that $11 billion I just spoke of. This really is the core of our committee's jurisdiction, and I hope we can make this happen. Mr. Dodaro, every year you and your talented staff provide us and the American people with a crucial service to make sure our tax dollars are spent wisely. So I want to once again thank you for your report and look forward to your testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses, the Honorable Gene Dodaro, Comptroller General of the United States. Mr. Dodaro is accompanied by the following people from the GAO, from my left to my right, who will also be sworn in. Ms. Kathleen Barrick, Managing Director for the Defense Capabilities and Management Team. Ms. Barbara Boberg, Managing Director of Education, Workforce, and Income Security Team. Ms. Angela Nikki Clowers, Managing Director for the Healthcare Team. Ms. Etta Emanuele Perez, Deputy General Counsel. Mr. Mark Gaffigan, Managing Director of the Natural Resources and Environment Team. Ms. Jessica Lucas-Judy, Director of the Strategic Issues Team. Ms. Michelle Mackin, Managing Director for the Contracting and National Security Acquisitions Team. Mr. J. Christopher Mim, Managing Director for the Strategic Issues Team. Mr. Dave Powner, Director of the Information Technology Team, and Mr. George Scott, Managing Director of the Homeland Security and Justice Team. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, and I would ask that you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The chair will reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and please be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows the remaining time during your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn on your microphone before speaking. And it is now my pleasure to recognize the witnesses, and Mr. Dodaro, please, we welcome your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, Ranking Member Ms. Norton, members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be here today to present our 8th annual report. I'm also very pleased to report that based on the first 7 years that we issued this report, we issued about 724 recommendations. 52% have been implemented, 24% have been partially implemented, and as a result of these actions, there are financial benefits that have accrued or will accrue to the federal government of $178 billion. Now, most of these actions were due to the Congress taking action to pass legislation to deal with a number of issues that we had raised. And given Congress's critical role, in the appendix to our testimony today are 58 open recommendations to the Congress that we have had made that could result in savings of tens of billions of dollars in additional money. So I commend those for your attention. Be happy to talk about them today. In the new report that we're issuing today, we have additional tens of actions, 68 new actions that can be implemented. For example, overlap and duplication in the U.S. Defense Department distribution centers could be made that could save, by DOD's estimates, $527 million over 5 years. There are tens of billions of dollars potentially that could be saved by treating low-level waste at the Hanford repository with cheaper methods, and it could actually get the job done faster. Also, at the Veterans Administration, there could be tens of millions of dollars in additional savings by consolidating their medical and surgical supplies purchasing program. Also, at the Coast Guard, they have identified themselves a number of stations that could be closed that overlap with other stations within the same time frame that could respond to search and rescue, and that could save them millions of dollars and improve their operations as well. So these are a few examples that we have. Now, we also, from our prior work, in addition to these new examples, have a number of outstanding examples that still need to be fully implemented. And they range from taking actions at the IRS and some other revenue options that could increase the revenue coming into the federal government through more efficient practices, and also save a lot of money, particularly in the Medicare area and in the Medicaid program, which is the fastest growing part of the federal government's budget from a spending standpoint. So we're very pleased that you're holding this hearing. We appreciate the attention given to our work, and my colleagues and I would be very pleased to respond to all questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you for that. We do appreciate all of the hard work. I will be holding my questions to the end, but it is my pleasure to now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the whole team. Let me just tell you, each and every hearing, not just this annual hearing, but each and every oversight hearing where we have input from GAO, it improves the quality of the hearing, but it also improves the quality of the information. So to you, Mr. Dodaro, and your entire team that is here today, a heartfelt thank you from members of Congress for handling government accountability in a nonpartisan way. I've wanted you to be partisan, and you've pushed back. You won't let me do that and that's good, because I think that gives confidence to both sides of the aisle. And so I just want to say thank you. You mentioned a number of unimplemented requests. 58, was that your testimony?
Yes, 58 open matters for congressional consideration. We have 324 recommendations to the executive branch.
And so in doing that, we're talking about billions of dollars, not millions of dollars. Is that correct?
Tens of billions.
Okay, tens of billions. And so can you find any reason other than complacency why Congress and the administration shouldn't implement at least 10% of those recommendations?
If I didn't think that all of them shouldn't be implemented, I wouldn't make them, Congress.
Okay, all right. So you would say that even a higher threshold than 10 to 20% of those should be implemented. You would suggest all of them?
Over time, over 3/4 of our recommendations are implemented in a 4-year period of time. So the recommendations in this area are a little lagging behind the overall rate that we have for our recommendations. So my goal and aspiration was that we could get at least to 75%, if not 100%.
All right. Well, you know well that what I will do is I will take a few of your things, and then we will start working on those and putting and applying pressure. And what would be helpful to me, and I want to drill down on the IRS for a second, because it seems like there, according to some of the testimony, that there's a number of really high-profile dollars that can potentially be saved, and I see you're getting a new witness to the table. So I guess let me ask, what is the IRS doing right and wrong? I think there's also the suggestion that if they just delayed refunds for a while, they could save dollars, and so I would ask you to help us understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, sure. Let me give you a broad picture, and then I'll ask Jessica to give a little bit more details. First of all, we think the IRS, they need better information technology systems. No question about that.
And so for the record, I am on my side of the aisle willing to give them additional appropriations to do exactly that. I think we have a bipartisan agreement on that. But go ahead.
But it has to be managed properly, and we've made a number of recommendations because they've wasted investments in the past in IT years ago. Secondly, they need a customer service strategy. They really don't have a customer service comprehensive strategy. They need a strategy for online services that could improve voluntary compliance as well. Congress could help IRS by lowering the threshold for electronic filing for partnership and corporations. Also allowing more W-2 information to be submitted electronically from employers. That would help them match faster. They wouldn't have to delay the time frame as well. So we have a number of specific recommendations in those areas. The number of our recommendations are actually incorporated in the package of bills that the House has just passed on IRS reform. But there are others that weren't included that should be included in those areas. And I'll ask Jessica to ask, the operative word for calling another witness up here is drill down.
Okay. And we've got 30 seconds for you to drill down before I get gavelled down, but go ahead.
So I would talk just about the tax fraud and noncompliance, that we've said that IRS should assess the benefits and the costs of holding all taxpayer refunds, not just the ones that are claiming the Earned Income Tax Credit and the AZTC, until later in the filing season. IRS's own analysis found that they could have potentially prevented an additional $35 to $350 million in fraudulent payments due to identity theft refund fraud, just by adjusting the holding period for about 2 weeks.
Wow. All right, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership.
And the gentleman yields back, and it's my privilege now to recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, thank you again for being here. My questions are going to relate to your report on the warfighting equipment. The transfer to military depots and shipyards, and your view that they're not being run as efficiently as they could be. Under BRAC, which is, of course, the base realignment and closure round in 2005, all of the services were required to transfer to the Defense Logistics Agencies, a function that we don't usually associate with the military: retail, supply, storage, and distribution functions at their depots by 2011. First, would you explain why this transfer was considered to be efficient for the government?
Yes, the Defense Logistics Agency, DLA, has a up-to-date information technology system that can allow real-time information in terms of the inventory drawdowns to trigger the ordering. So it's a much more efficient process. And the Air Force and the Navy, except for one exception, did transfer the responsibilities, but the Army and the Marines have not, and that's
and that's where I'm going to focus. So these are like functions in the Defense Logistics Agency, rather than spreading these functions among various parts of the military, as I understand it. It's kind of classic efficiency. But your report states that the Army, you mentioned, and the Marine Corps have not yet transferred these functions to the Defense Logistics Agency, and neither have the Navy shipyards. The initial efforts to transfer these programs at the Air Force Logistics Centers and the Navy Fleet Readiness Centers related, we are told, to personnel reluctance to trust the DLA. So first, let me know what kinds of personnel we're talking about, and why, for example, are we talking about uniformed personnel being reluctant to transfer a function?
I'm going to ask Ms. Barrick, our defense expert, to answer that question.
Thank you for your question. The reluctance is coming primarily from the civilians who manage this process at the maintenance depots within the Army and the Marine Corps. Now, the actual BRAC recommendation was that the services transfer the storage, distribution, and supply operations to DLA to achieve efficiencies. Now, the Army and the Marine Corps did transfer storage and distribution. They have not transferred supply. They've raised concerns that retail supply operations are very interwoven with maintenance operations. The Army also raised the point that they recently developed a new information system that provided greater visibility into supply operations. They were reluctant to give that up.
Do you regard their pushback for the reasons you named as worthy of your consideration? Or do you think they should continue as the other agencies have done?
I think they should continue. Some of these same concerns were raised by the Navy and the Air Force Air Logistics Centers and maintenance facilities that they overcome. For example, they were concerned that they wouldn't have visibility over supply operations. DLA actually gave them access to their information system that enabled that visibility. They saw savings of $710 million as a result of that consolidation.
Are these are non-uniform personnel? Would they too be transferred? I mean, I'm trying to get at their reluctance and what you can do about their reluctance.
Yeah, it does require transferring individuals from the services to the Defense Logistics Agency. That's part of what the transfer would entail. It also requires using DLA's business processes for managing the supply operations versus the services.
We have some of these outstanding since 2011. What can you do to feed these since you still stand behind the efficiency of these transfers? What can be done to speed these transfers?
Well, there's two things. One is to try to prevail upon the Defense Department themselves, which for the last 3 years, every year I send each head of major department agency in the federal government a list of open GAO recommendations, and I prioritize which ones that I believe still should be implemented. So number one is working directly with the Defense Department. Number two, an alternative route, is when we go to the Congress and there are requirements put in the Defense Authorization Bill or the Defense Appropriation Bill that require them to implement GAO's recommendations. Both of those bills this year included GAO recommendations that needed to be implemented, and that's how some of the savings that I reported of the $178 billion, and the services, for example, were duplicating combat uniforms, which complicated even joint operations. You know, it had operational effect as well as dollar effects, but the Defense and Authorization Bill required them to deal with that issue. So, you know, we're trying to, both avenues, working with the agencies and working with the appropriate committees in the Congress.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, maybe we might even have a follow-up hearing to press this, since they are making some progress and may need a little more of a nudge. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield, of course, back.
And I thank the gentlelady, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Bloom, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Russell. And Mr. Dodaro, good to see you again. Thank you for being here. Shortly after I was elected 3 years ago, I held a town hall back in Iowa, and I was explaining what committees I was on. And I mentioned that I was on Oversight Committee, and that our job was to investigate and bring some daylight to waste, fraud, and abuse. And an elderly farmer raised his hand, and he said, "Waste, fraud, and abuse. Aren't those the three branches of government?" True story, but not because of your department, that is for sure. There's a lot of cynicism out there, is my point, and for the most part, it's well-deserved. I come from the private sector, and in the private sector, failure is penalized. failure is penalized. However, in Washington, D.C., in the swamp here, there is no penalty for failure. Would you agree with that?
Not completely. I do think, a number of people are removed or lose their job over time, perhaps not as many as should, and some agencies are forced to take action when they need to, but by and large, the incentives are not aligned properly for to reinforce proper behavior and penalize inappropriate behavior or inefficiencies or waste. So I agree with you with some exceptions.
Yeah, that was one of my comments, was the incentives in this town seem to be perverse to me. For example, what incentive is there for a government employee or an agency to save taxpayers' money? What incentive is there? Is there any today?
What we do is prevail upon people's commitment to public service and to be good stewards. The reward systems, like for example at GAO, I reward our people based upon what we're able to do to save people money, save taxpayers money. So there has to be a good reward system in place to do that. It doesn't exist throughout the federal government, though.
In the private sector, if you save the company $1 million, you probably get a percentage of that. You get some large bonus, and well worth it. Do we have that? I don't think we have that in the federal government, but what if we did? Is that an idea worth exploring?
Yeah, definitely. I think there should be positive reward systems in place, and theoretically, the performance management systems in agencies should do that.
Should.
They should.
Should. Do
Right.
they? Do they?
I'm not positive in all cases. It's at the level of what you would expect. I'm most familiar with our own, and I know at GAO it works that way, but I'm not sure I could say that about the rest of the federal agencies and departments. And I think you need we've said that some of the performance management approaches in the federal government, the civil service system is outdated. It's not aligned properly with modern compensation systems, modern classification systems, and needs revamped. And that could certainly be part of that revamping.
Let's go to 60,000 feet if we could for the last minute 50 that I have. Let me ask you this question. Do you feel that our agencies are being held accountable? Do you feel that the management in those agencies are being held accountable and that the employees in those agencies are being held accountable? And if you're going to say somewhat, give me a grade. Where are we at? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Because the federal government's getting so big, seriously, I question if it can be managed anymore.
Yeah, I definitely think it could be managed. I think we're not, some agencies better than others, okay? But by and large, I think that much more could be done to hold the agencies accountable. And I think this is, Congress's responsibility. I think there needs to be more oversight hearings. I've said this a number of times. Where we see positive change, we see the Congress's hand has to be in this area. And that, to me, is very important. Now, we work also with OMB to try to create change within the executive branch. And I meet with the heads of departments and agencies as well to try to institute their change. But really, the best incentives I've seen to hold people accountable over the years are good, rigorous congressional oversight. That will produce change, with or without legislation, I might add.
So some folks back in Iowa comment, boy, OGR, you hold some great hearings. Really good stuff, tough questions. What happens after that?
Yeah, there's not enough.
What happens after the tough questions?
There's not enough follow-up. There's not enough follow-up.
How do we change that?
Yeah, I think you have to be clear. I've been involved in some things over the years where there are a series of hearings. I remember in the Senate when initially we were having questions about the personnel security clearances were behind, that were not being done timely. They held hearings there was either a quarter or every 6 months. So there was a series. People knew from the agencies that it wasn't like, gee, I got to get through this hearing and it's going to be over with. They'll forget about it. They had follow-up hearings. You had follow-up meetings with the agency officials. GAO can help in the follow-up activities as well. So there has to be a commitment to follow through until you know that the problem's solved. And it's not just bringing...
That's where we're weak, I think.
Yeah, that's where, yeah, I agree. I mean, Congress does a good job at shining a light, but then as soon as the light goes away, the problem doesn't get much better.
My time's expired, but hats off to you from the spoke a lone voice from the private sector. I think you're doing an amazing job. Your agency does an amazing job, and I, for one, am so glad that you're here today.
Oh, thank you very much,
I
Congressman.
yield back the time I do not have.
Gentleman yields back. It's my privilege now to recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for being here today. This report is so important. I would like to ask 2 defense questions, so you may want to get your defense person up there.
All right.
First, in your appendix, you mentioned an unmet recommendation from 2013 about joint basing. I'm on the Armed Services Committee and may need some help from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this. The Armed Services Committee has banned the Pentagon from even thinking about another BRAC round, even though the Air Force has testified to us that as much as 25% of their facilities are surplus, unneeded, burden for the taxpayers. But they are unable to do anything to adjust that. So I wasn't sure if your recommendation from 2013 on joint basing was specifically on that topic. You mentioned the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, but you don't quite nail the fact that Congress has stopped the Pentagon from trying to be efficient. We don't even allow them to think about that.
Yeah. There's two things that we have, and I'll ask Kathy to explain in more detail. One is the excess infrastructure that they have. That's actually on the high-risk list that we keep as part of the federal government. So we believe they need to do a better job in that area. We've also had many recommendations, and most of them have not been implemented yet, as to how the BRAC process could be improved, because they really didn't realize all the benefits that they promised in the initial activities in those areas. So if Congress decides that the next BRAC round to go forward with that, I would suggest that that be conditional on implementing GAO's recommendations, so you get better cost estimates and you get fewer changes along the way between the recommendations from BRAC and actually what gets implemented by the Defense Department, because you have a several-year time frame in there. Secondly, on joint basing, this was an initiative by the Department, and what we found there was that it was to get common standards among the services. So instead of getting a common standard, they took the highest standard that any service had and raised everything up to that level in order to get buy-in, and so they really weren't able to get, in any discernible way, cost savings. But Kathy?
Yeah, with respect to the joint basing recommendations, our overall position was that DOD didn't embrace that 2005 BRAC recommendation to try to achieve efficiencies with joint basing. A key objective of that initiative was to achieve some significant savings. But with the way they developed the common standards, as Jean mentioned, with the way they approached the effort, they really weren't designing it to achieve the savings that were possible. So we made a series of recommendations to DOD to relook their strategy for joint basing and take advantage of some opportunities for additional savings. DOD had concurred with that recommendation routinely, so we ended up recommending to the Congress that they direct DOD to take that action. With respect to BRAC, generally, DOD has, I think over the last 7 years, requested a BRAC round. They, in fact, did not request it in their most recent budget estimate. But setting BRAC aside, a point that we've routinely made with the Defense Department is they do have some existing authorities to realign and close facilities under Title 10, separate from a BRAC. It does require congressional notification if it exceeds certain thresholds, but DOD has never gone through the process to take any significant action that would actually require congressional notification. One of the new areas we mentioned in this year's report is the proliferation of distribution centers within the department. There's 256 of them. DOD themselves identified they can achieve significant savings in the hundreds of millions of dollars closing those, but they are not taking action on that. They're saying in the absence of a BRAC, they're not willing to use their existing authorities to do that.
Thank you. In my short time remaining, you mentioned that the transition to the new M-code GPS system will involve retrofitting 716 weapon systems with cards And the Pentagon has no plan right now in place to unify the design and implementation of those cards, and most are not even funded. So this is a pretty crucial function, and we can't let any of these weapon systems be down because of a lack of communication with the satellite, and yet the Pentagon isn't planning sensibly to meet the needs. So what do we do?
I think that the Congress should require them to have a unified approach to this area. I mean, even replacing a small amount of these receiver cards. In the receiver card, the M code is to be a stronger codes, to be encrypted, and it makes sense to do this. But what we've seen is there hasn't been a good coordination between actually putting the satellite up and having the ground system that could receive the signals and then transmit them to these receiver cards in the weapon systems. This report this year focuses on those receiver cards. And you're right, I mean, it has to get to so many weapon systems. They don't have a way to share lessons learned, to get common requirements. And what will happen, as we've seen in the past, without proactive leadership, the costs will proliferate. And then the Congress will be put in a box to say, well, either you give us the money or this investment's not going to work. And I think but Congress requiring them to have a better coordinated, better management approach on this could forestall a lot of problems down the road and certainly contain costs in a much better way.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman, and I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, we thank you for your continued service to our country and appreciate your willing to serve in the capacity. It's my belief that improved coordination between the Food and Drug Administration and the Food Safety and Inspection Service on the oversight of imported seafood would help the agencies better manage fragmentation and more consistently protect consumers from unsafe drug residues. So I've got a couple questions here. In your opinion, does it make sense to have a separate program at USDA responsible for the food safety of one species of imported fish when FDA is responsible for regulating safety for all other types of fish and seafood?
Yeah, we initially recommended that not be funded, but Congress overrode us and decided that it needed to be implemented. So, you know, our approach now is, you know, Congress made that decision. At least we can make sure that they're coordinating effectively and operating together, and that's the focus of our recommendation at this point in time.
Thank you. I believe you found an example of the USDA setting a safety standard for a drug residue at a level that was 20 times higher than FDA standards. Should we be concerned about the safety of imported catfish with these kinds of numbers?
I think that we saw a lot of inconsistency between the FDA and FSIS. You give the example, the 20 times number. That's the genesis of our rec, and we are concerned that there's a discrepancy between the two agencies.
And Mr. Dodaro, you touched on this a little bit earlier in your comments. GAO has recommended better coordination. What are the current methods for sharing information between the agencies, and what change does GAO think needs to be implemented moving forward?
They definitely need to have a memorandum of understanding to reach agreement on what drugs are tested. We also point out in the report that one of the agencies is testing 76 different drugs, another one only 27 different drugs. So they need to come to some agreement on this. And typically, the mechanism for that agreement is a memorandum of understanding with written roles and responsibilities, written agreements to come to a common testing approach and sharing of information to make sure that it's consistent with the industry, but also, you know, efficient use of federal resources, and that they have the proper people to do that. So that's what we're recommended that they do.
Anything that
No, just the commitment to do what they've talked about doing through some of these memorandums of agreement.
Well, then, do you believe that there are steps Congress should take to ensure the effective coordination, that it's got some teeth to this? Is there something that you would recommend?
Yes, yes. I mean, there should be reporting requirements that Congress puts on the agencies to report their progress in implementing GAO's recommendations. I would very much support that and think it would be needed. A number of times, you know, agencies will tell us that they're going to implement the recommendation, but we don't close it until they're actually finished and have something in place. And sometimes these things get implemented, and sometimes they don't, and because of bureaucratic resistance to change in a lot of cases, to be honest. And so I think Congress's oversight and have them to report their progress until it's fully implemented would be warranted.
Okay. Was there something else?
And you could keep asking us to look at it, and we'll come up with those examples to put the light on it.
Well, as long as there's people like Mr. Meadows to my left and others, I can imagine those questions will continue to come forward.
I agree.
And once again, thank you. I have notes in front of me for my 4 questions. You have no notes in front of you, but continue to answer the questions. Thank you for being so well informed. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, and it's now my privilege to recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for your exceptional efforts of GAO in compiling the 2018 duplication report. Back in 2014, Congress passed the Veterans Access, Choice, and Accountability Act to help the Department of Veterans Affairs address serious problems with appointment scheduling, unreliable data on wait times, and inadequate coordination of veteran care between VA and non-VA medical providers. The Choice Act established the Commission on Care, which concluded in June 2016 that the care by the Department's Veterans Health Administration is inconsistent from facility to facility. Several of the Commission's recommendations focus on the VA's workforce. GAO's latest report found that, ironically, the Veterans Health Administration overall's workforce problems can be traced to its own HR staff decreasing in size, not being adequately overseen, and lacking any assessment of skill gaps and training. Do you agree?
Yes.
In turn, the GAO report said the attrition in HR offices has led to difficulties in hiring for clinical positions in medical centers and increases in administrative errors. Is that also your understanding?
Yes, that's what we reported and made recommendations to address that issue.
Okay. On a positive note, the GAO report states that as of January 2018, staff at the Department of Veterans Affairs had developed and began using an online competency tool to identify competency gaps in the human resource offices at the medical centers. The department has also established a clear lines of authority to require HR staff to complete a competency assessment. However, the department still must use this data to address competency gaps in human resource offices. Is that also your understanding?
Yeah, yes, it is. I'm pleased they're taking some action, but they need to follow through, just as we talked about in the prior exchange with the Congressman.
As of a year ago, the Department of Veterans Affairs said it was in the early stages of revising its performance management system. This revision included effective use of both monetary and non-monetary awards to promote employee performance. It also explored the use of the e-performance information technology system to appraise employee performance. Can you give us an update as to the department's efforts since then?
Yeah, they really haven't taken much action since then, according to our team. Right. Yeah, they have not in that area. They moved out in the other area that you mentioned, but they haven't moved out in that area. I think it's very important. The exchange I had with Congressman Bloom talked about the incentives and disincentives, and really you need to have a good performance management system that's up to date in the Veterans Health Administration. So I will urge them when I meet with the new secretary. I met with Secretary Shinseki, Secretary McDonald, Secretary Shulkin multiple times to try to urge them to implement GAO's recommendations. I will continue to press in this area. We designated veterans health care a high-risk area in 2015, and so I'm dedicated, and our team is to follow up.
So just their lack of follow-up is what you think will improve performance?
Yeah, right now, and they need leadership. I mean, they need leadership. I mean, I'm very worried about the Veterans Administration. They have some of the most entrenched management problems in the federal government. That's why we put them on the high-risk list. They're making efforts to come up with a plan now, but it's been 3 years since we put them on the list, and they really haven't finalized a good plan to come off the list. We're working with them. They're making progress. I don't want to say that they're not. But there needs to be more urgency to deal with their problems over there. And there's key vacancies not only now at the secretary level, but also some of the undersecretary positions, the CIO, is open, and so I think Congress should be very concerned and focus on getting proper leadership over there, and then make sure that there's effective follow-up to resolve their problems. I think our veterans deserve no less.
I definitely agree, and I guess that was my next question. What more can Congress do?
A lot, a lot. And I'd be happy to work and have our team work with the Congress in doing this. We have a great deal of knowledge. Ms. Nikki Clowers is here. She's our expert in the Veterans Administration. We've been working with the VA committees as well, but I think Congress's role in this whole area is very pivotal.
Well, thank you for your honesty, and we need to take you up on your offer. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. It's my privilege to recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Dodaro, first of all, let me thank you and your staff for the outstanding work and cooperation on some critical issues that you've brought to this committee's attention on numerous occasions. That is dealing with improper payments and also the tax gap. And in that regard, I'd like to ask you, what's the last year that the IRS reported on tax gap?
I think it was based on 2008. Yeah, 2008 information, and that estimate was a net tax gap of a little over $400 billion. That's an annual.
That's $406 billion.
Right.
They don't report annually. That's on a periodic basis. Is there any rhyme or reason that determines when they report that?
No, initially years ago, they didn't report an estimate. It was a GAO recommendation that required them, that they finally implemented to come up with it. In all fairness, it requires a lot of effort and time, and they certainly haven't had excess resources lately to do it. But I think it could be done on a more regular basis. Right now, it's just dependent on them. I mean, Congress could set a reasonable interval for them to update that information, particularly given the changes that have been made in the tax law recently. I would hope after a period of time and there's some experience, they update it.
I would appreciate it if you had some recommendations on what that timetable ought to be, and if you would provide them to my office. In that regard, this is one of the points that I've been raising about the tax reform, that one of the main objectives was to reduce the complexity of the tax code in order to reduce the uncollected taxes, to reduce the tax gap. You've made numerous recommendations that I think we need to implement, the IRS needs to implement, and Congress needs to exercise oversight over it, because it's one of these things that I tell people I have moments here when I think my head will explode. And when we talk about $800 billion deficits, and half of that could have been erased by collecting all the taxes, plus the interest on that we're having to borrow, drives me nuts, along with my next topic, which you're well familiar with, and that's improper payments.
Yes.
And we're, again, very fortunate to have the expertise of the GAO available to try to work out a reasonable solution. I want to talk a little bit about some specifics on the improper payments. The premium tax credit improper payments, we don't really talk about that a lot. You have a number in your report of $35 billion. Is that savings, or is that the net cost?
That's a total cost.
Okay. Do you have any idea of what we might expect in savings?
No, not really yet. They really haven't done a lot of the proper assessments and have much experience in that area yet to come up with any estimates. I think it'd be good to press them to move forward in that area, and then the congressional encouragement would be helpful.
When we talk about encouragement, people generally interpret that to mean negative. I think we ought to take a more positive approach to this on the whole spectrum of improper payments. And you touched on this earlier with the IRS, with their outdated IT systems. That's a problem throughout the federal government. If you look at the improper payments, and this is the work that your staff has done, over 20% of the problem is antiquated data systems. And I think that lends itself to other errors on the administrative side, which is another 30-something%. So if we could deal with this in a more positive way, and one of the things that I'm thinking about doing is that the savings that we get by eliminating improper payments might go back into to replacing antiquated IT systems, and I think it needs to be done federal government-wide so that you have the interfaces that are necessary. It's one of the problems with Social Security. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. The systems are a key part of this, particularly if you want to prevent things from happening up front. But there also has to be good data sharing to go along with that. You can have great systems, but if they're not allowed to share data, like for example, one of our recommendations is that the Congress direct the Social Security Administration to give the full death master file to the Treasury Department. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me that we have a do not pay list, and we have one department that has the most comprehensive list of deceased people that won't give it to the Treasury Department because they believe it can't be shared. Another example is in our Railroad Retirement Board. They're using earnings data that's 2 or 3 years old from IRS, and they need access to the new hire database. So I think a combination of proper incentives, and I'm glad to see the administration set a goal for reducing improper payments, and they have IT modernization on the President's management agenda, but there has to be sharing of information to go along with it to really, I think, have a comprehensive package.
Well, my goal for reducing improper payments is considerably higher than the administration's. I've had this conversation with OMB Director Mulvaney, who's a dear friend. But again, I commend you. I'm one of these odd birds that looks forward to the GAO reports. There's some people look forward to the next great novel. I look forward to the next great GAO report. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and it's my privilege now to recognize the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to say publicly, Mr. Nero, thank you and your staff for putting together this report. And as my colleagues have mentioned, it's impressive that your recommendations have led to 178 billion in taxpayer savings over the past years. One example that I really want on the record is one of the past recommendations that has helped to make a difference to the people in my state. In 2016, the GAO recommended that the Treasury relocate up to $2 billion from an underused program and moved it toward the hardest hit fund. As a result of that, it went a long way to cities like Detroit to remove blight and to take care of the neighborhoods. So I want you to really have that sense of what you do is making a difference. And I just want to say thank you to your staff. One of the areas, Mr. Darrell, is IRS for me as well. Major changes to the tax laws will hit everyone in 2019, and I want to know if the IRS is helping families understand the impact, and especially low-income families. There are needed taxpayer assistance and outreach, and there is a proposed $23 million cut to IRS. Can you describe GAO's current efforts to monitor the IRS and what it plans to do over the next years to ensure that the community has the support that they need in low-income areas?
Yes, for a number of years, we've had an outstanding recommendation that IRS needed to improve their customer service strategy. We're looking at their efforts to do that now and the implementation of the new tax law. Ms. Jessica Lucas-Judy here is our expert in the IRS, and I'll ask her to elaborate on what we're doing.
Okay, thank you.
So for customer service, we've said that they need to have a comprehensive strategy, and they have put together a draft, and so we're looking at the extent to which it lays out specific, realistic targets for phone service and correspondence, and more importantly even, that it lays out a roadmap for them of what resources are needed to get them there. In addition, as Mr. Dodaro said, we're also looking at their implementation of the changes to the tax law. As you know, there are quite a few things that the IRS has to do. And so we're looking at how they're communicating those changes, how they're making decisions about prioritizing.
So with all the vacancies that you outlined and the challenges that we see if the cuts are made to IRS, when do you alert Congress that we are getting ready to step into a crisis? There's a number of, I understand the yearly report, and you even stated that our response rate is that Congress has addressed about 42% of your recommendations. How do you bring to our attention, are the committees looking at the recommendations? And specifically, what is the impact if we don't act on these recommendations? You give your report, but we're only looking at 42% of them.
I think, well, first of all, we try to alert the Congress through our reports. We testify before a wide range of congressional committees every year. We brief congressional staff every day. Members every day on our work. I mean, we have close working relationships with virtually all the committees in the Congress, about half of the subcommittees that we do work for. We do about 800 requests a year from the Congress, and so we're constantly trying to alert the Congress to emerging problems and challenges and encouraging them to implement our recommendations.
How do you alert Congress?
Pardon me?
What format do you use to alert?
Well, we have two formats. We have this annual report. We have regular reports that we issue virtually every day on specific topics. Last year, we issued about 700 reports to the Congress with over 1,400 recommendations. And then every 2 years, we issue a high-risk list of the highest risk in the federal government. And if there's something that I think rises to that level out of the interim 2-year period, we do a special announcement. We just did one in January on personnel security clearances across the government. I'm very concerned. There are 700,000 backlog of clearances that are not being made. There's not clear how the transfer is going to work between OPM and DOD on a number of issues. They don't have quality standards yet in place, metrics for the security clearances. The timing is still not good in terms of them getting it done in a timely manner. So I think this is a big national security issue. So I put it on the high-risk list out of cycle. The last high-risk list, I raised the 2020 census. I'm very concerned.
I'm very concerned
about the 2020
I'm
census.
very
so
concerned.
we do regular hearings on that as well. So we at GAO, I mean, we try to keep the Congress very informed about our views on risk and what needs to be done to address the risk. Now, the recommendations that have not been implemented, quite frankly, we're leaving tens of billions of dollars on the table in savings that could be made. I think the Congress could be more aggressive in their oversight of the agencies to ensure effective implementation of our recommendations, and I would encourage that, and GAO will support you.
Thank you. My time is up, and I just want to say to the chairman, the high-risk list should be something that's a priority for us to bring forward in our hearings as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and if time permits, I have questions pertaining to two vastly different subjects. First would be the Social Security disability appeals process, then second would be about STEM. I don't think you can get any further apart than those two issues, but I'm going to try in my 5 minutes to address those two issues with questions. First of all, in Kentucky, to say that the Social Security disability program is abused would be an understatement. We have certain counties in Kentucky where you drive down the road and every billboard is a disability insurance law firm. Some of those counties have as many as 1 in 4 adults between the ages of 18 and 63 that are drawing full disability, and then we have counties in Kentucky where that number's smaller than 1 out of 20. So it's just kind of depends on the location of the state and the number of people that are involved in that industry in Kentucky. But one of the things that we deal with in my congressional office is obviously casework. And we have people that are truly disabled that we're trying to get through the process, and the appeals process sometimes takes a long time. And these are legitimate people that really are disabled that have paid into the Social Security system that are trying to get their disability insurance, and they get frustrated because they know people that have probably abused the system in the past, and it's just one of the things that we spend a lot of time with my caseworkers dealing with. I know that the Social Security Administration has reviewed this, and in 2017, the GAO recommended the SSA systematically evaluate its quality assurance reviews and take steps to reduce or better manage unnecessary overlap among them. My first question, there are 5 separate quality review processes. Why does SSA have 5 separate quality assurance review processes?
That's the question we asked and asked them to take a look at. We don't think they need all of them. Barbara Boberg is our expert in this area, and actually she's our expert in STEM too. So while you got 2 different topics, I got 1 expert to cover.
That's great.
Barbara?
We were surprised that they had 5 different processes. They're across a couple of different components at SSA, and they all have the same overall goal, which is to make the appeals result more accurate.
Right.
And to help the administrative law judges do a better job. They look at the cases a little differently, but they sample in roughly the same way. So they can actually be looking at the same case in more than 1 quality assurance review. So we thought they should really look at that. It's not a lot of money in the context where we're talking about defense and VA health. It's $11 million. But we thought that they could coordinate and potentially improve the quality assurance process as they do that. They have taken some steps. They have created another component in which 4 of these 5 are in that component.
So are they currently taking steps to review the process?
They're taking steps. They're not there. But they just begun.
How else could the Social Security Administration resources be better utilized in terms of processing disability claims?
They have put a lot of emphasis at the appeals level because what you're seeing is it can take, there are more than 600 days now that people are kept waiting for an appeals decision. And that's a long time when you're not working and waiting.
And legal fees are piling up as well.
Yes, and they have done things, for example, they are taking cases, so they may take a case from Kentucky, and if the Kentucky administrative law judge group is really, really backlogged, they will send that case to another ALJ group to try to move things along. We actually have a report coming out on that in the next couple of months. They are doing a number of things, but what happens is they focus on appeals and they take their eye off the initial decision-making ball, and then people start waiting longer for an initial decision. So we're trying to get them to look at it holistically.
Yeah, Congressman, we'd be happy to give you a comprehensive list of every recommendation we have for the Social Security appeals or disability process, including the appeals and initial claims. This has been on our high-risk list, I just mentioned that, for well over a decade. So I think this could be an important issue. And it's not only Social Security, it's VA as well. Right. That's on our high-risk list, too. I just testified at their appeals reform hearing that we had. So we'll give you a comprehensive list.
Okay, thank you. And my time has expired, so I didn't get to ask the questions about STEM, but I appreciate your answers and look forward to getting that report. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I'd be happy to give the answers to the STEM for the record or meet with you separately, Congressman. Sure.
The gentleman yields back, and we may have some time for follow-on questions if you like. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, General Dodaro. Good to see you again. And let me say, I think the high-risk list is one of the most important things you all do in terms of giving us guidance and throwing down red flags on areas of concern. And we want to try to redouble our efforts to work with GAO and your team to address those issues. One of the issues, of course, that was on that list that I took seriously when I came to Congress, among many, was the whole issue of how the federal government manages and procures information technology. And just wondering, in terms of duplicative costs, and I see you've been joined by Mr. Powner, who's worked diligently with us on implementation of legislative vehicles designed to address the concern you've highlighted, and we're going to do more. We're drafting a bill right now in FedRAMP we'll be working with you on, and we want to make sure that scorecard for FTAR captures progress or lack thereof. But could you talk a little bit about the role of IT in terms of duplication, duplicative costs? Because we look at legacy systems, people look and say, well, my God, we're spending $96 billion a year on IT in the federal government. But so much of that is designed to simply keep Band-Aids and wire together to keep legacy systems running. But also there are duplicative costs. You've got multiple email systems. You've got some of which don't talk to each other. You've got all kinds of software that some of which is outdated and so forth. And I just wonder if you could, either one of you or both of you, talk about that, because that's something we can do something about tomorrow, in theory. And we're trying our best to create a legislative framework to push that along. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
That's definitely a potential area for billions of dollars in savings. Data center consolidations. There are over 12,000 data centers when we started this initiative in OMB, working with the Congress before. There's several thousand have been closed, but by the end of this year, hopefully over 7,000 will be closed. That's billions of dollars savings. But even on the existing data centers, they're not fully utilized. If you look at their performance metrics, both from a server standpoint as well as the facility itself, software inventories, new systems, consolidations. I'll ask Mr. Piner, who knows the details, to give you a little bit more details. But I think this is a target-rich area for the Congress, and we're poised to work with you to try to identify more opportunities for savings. Dave?
Yeah, Representative Connolly, so if you start with data centers, we've saved about $4 billion to date, and your oversight has been instrumental with FTAR and your follow-up hearings with the scorecard. We've had 5. I know there's another one scheduled next month. But when you really look at data center consolidation, there's a lot more on the table, as Comptroller General Dodaro mentioned, billions more. DOD alone, when we started data center consolidation, had an estimate of $4.8 billion in savings. They've only saved a couple $100 million. So there's a huge opportunity there. When you mentioned the duplication, we've saved about $2 billion on duplicative email, HR systems and the like. We still have a long ways to go there. We're well aware, based on the work we're doing for you on individual requests and your scorecard, that there's many more opportunities to reduce those duplicative commodity systems.
I do want to say, I think this is a great example of what you were talking about in response to my colleagues, the collaboration, actually, not just guidance from, but hands-on collaboration from GAO and this committee in trying to effectuate positive change that frees up dollars, saves dollars, and makes the government more secure and more efficient. And I want to applaud Mr. Powner and you, Mr. Dodaro, for taking that lead and doing that. I think it's really terribly important.
It's also a good example, if I might add, Congressman, to the importance of congressional follow-up.
Yeah.
And I think, compliments are due to you, Mr. Hurd, Mr. Meadows, Ms. Kelly, for your constant follow-up in this activities, and that's what can be yielded. Billions of savings, more efficient operations, but it requires that commitment. We're happy to do our part.
I would just end with just a thought. I was listening to one of the questions about, well, how do you keep us informed on this list? And it may be that we may want to look at like a mid-year reminder. We gave you 70 recommendations. You've acted on 30. There's still 40 more to go. We estimate that could free up $10 billion, because our attention span up here, we've been accused of having a very short attention span. And I think that's unfair, but a little reminder list might help. So at any rate, we might want to work on some mechanisms so we keep those issues in front of us, because I don't think it's always willful ignoring of recommendations. I think sometimes we just, in the hustle and bustle of life in this town, we lose focus. And,
Yeah, but we'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
And I've also encouraged, we do updated a list with the beginning of each new Congress, and I've encouraged particularly oversight committees to have then a series of hearings on the individual areas that I think will be helpful. But this year we started, I wanted to do updates on a couple critical areas. So we're due to have an update on the cyber security issue, critical infrastructure protection, protecting personally identifiable information later this summer.
Great.
So we'll make sure that
we look forward to working with you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Now privileged to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Gene. Mr. Dodaro, you've been doing great work for a long time, so we really appreciate it. There's a definite harmony between the work on this committee and the work that your folks do. I want to raise an issue regarding retroactive classification. We talk about the information we get in order to make decisions that are necessary. In Afghanistan, we've come upon this change that was introduced by the Trump administration recently, where the information that we usually get from the Special Inspector General for Afghan reconstruction used to send us publicly available information quarterly about troop size, about the Afghan National Army performance assessments, casualties, operational readiness, actual and authorized strength figures. We had these ghost units. We're paying 75% of the freight in Afghanistan right now. We give them $5 billion a year, American taxpayer money, to pay their troops. And we cannot discuss publicly, and the public doesn't get information about the fraud that was going on there for a very long time. It may still be going on. We've got people on the ground there. But we don't get information on the trained and untrained personnel. They've even classified U.S. airstrikes now in Afghanistan. So there's a whole swath of information that normally, well, under President Bush and under President Obama, that information came directly to the public and to Congress, so we could talk about it. We've got folks on the ground there, and we require that information to act decisively on behalf of our sons and daughters in uniform. And we need information on that war. We are at war. So Mr. Cummings and I wrote a letter to the Trump administration saying that we wanted that rescinded. But could you talk a little bit about the obstruction and the difficulty for you and for Congress in doing our jobs with the lack of information coming out of the coming out of DOD right now, and also coming out of Afghanistan?
I asked Kathy Berrick to join me. She's our defense expert, so I'll ask her to give her views on this. But I would say, right after 9/11, we saw a change in the classification approach in the federal government to classify more documents. After that occurred, we were asked to look at the classification practices of a number of agencies and to look at whether or not they were being consistent and whether or not they were going, what their procedures were for classification. Then there seemed to be settling down and an equilibrium in place over time. But what I've seen over the years is that sort of approach ebbs and flows over periods of time. I think it's very legitimate questions that Congress should ask about the level of classification. We don't have classification authority at GAO. We're bound by by law. We have to treat the information that we use in the same manner as the agencies that we receive the information from. Now, what we try to do is produce a detailed classified report and then a public version of virtually everything that we do. But it's not easy. to do that and to get the classification approaches through DOD and state and, other agencies, Homeland Security. It's not just DOD. But Kathy can give you a little bit more insight, but we'd be happy to work with you on this issue.
Please, thank you.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there is an initiative within the Defense Department to look more closely at information they allow to go into the public domain, and we're certainly experiencing that on our products when we send them to the department for a sensitivity review. Just earlier this week, we issued a public version of a classified report on DoD's first deployment of the F-35 to Japan that identified some significant issues and that are in the classified domain. I'll make a couple of points. First is we can certainly still brief you all and our congressional staff on the results of our classified work, given that they have clearances, so we'll continue to do that. We also have been asked, given this concern, to look specifically at classification within the intelligence community, how they're handling that for the intelligence agencies, half of which fall under the Defense Department. So we'll be looking at that in detail and providing recommendations to you all. And my experience as well is this tends to ebb and flow as Congress raises concerns, as the press asks more questions. We'll see what, if any, changes the department makes.
Thank you. I do have a classified briefing in the SCIF tomorrow afternoon with the Special Inspector for Afghan Reconstruction, but obviously I can't discuss that with my constituents, and they're paying the bill. So, but thank you both for your wonderful work. Really appreciate it. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to get into questions in just a moment on both VA medical supply and DOD headquarters reductions and workforce requirements based on that not really being covered thus far in the hearing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of those. But before I do, I'm just struck by the fact that Milton Friedman once observed that the only way to make government more efficient was to make it smaller. That fundamental to the democratic process was inefficiency. If we wanted efficiency, we'd go out and get a king or a dictator. They could be quite efficient. We'd lose the open political system. But the back and forth of, one man's gold is another man's dirt and vice versa, that there's just built-in efficiency. So I'm just struck in reading this report when you talk about tens and tens and tens of $1 billion of discovered waste, and that's not even the undiscovered portion that might be out there. Was Milton Friedman right?
Well, I'm not an economist by training, but I'm an auditor, and I have been a student of government for 45 years, and I would say that when things don't work in the government, a new thing is created and the old thing remains. And that cumulative process over time adds clearly to the inefficiencies in the government operations. And there's a lack of attention to routinely addressing these issues, both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch. And I think both branches can do much more to make government more efficient, and we're happy to help in that regard.
No, and I appreciate your work on that front. So I'll take that as a yes, that Milton Friedman was right, that ultimately an important measure toward making government more efficient is, in fact, making it smaller, because indeed, as you use the word built-in, there are built-in inefficiencies, and I think we all acknowledge those in looking at this process. Getting down in the weeds, in the few minutes that I have, I don't know what you'd rather stress, but I'd love to get your thoughts on both the VA medical supply, given its importance to a lot of veterans out there, and or DOD headquarters, going back to what you've just framed it. Oftentimes we come up with the new, but we still leave the old. Some of the headquarters is redundant from a need standpoint. Thoughts on that as well? I'd be curious to hear thoughts on both of those.
Sure. First, on the VA medical and surgical supplies area, they started an initiative that was intended to save about $150 billion. And this was to consolidate purchasing across all their medical centers. But they limited the number of items that they wanted to collect. They had no overarching strategy. They were supposed to involve the clinicians in deciding how to do this. They didn't do that. as much as they should have, and thus they weren't very successful with their initiative. So we made a number of recommendations on how to address that and actually achieve some of those savings. So they're starting to move out, adding more commodities that could be made. With the VA medical centers operate in a very decentralized operation. And certainly, consolidating purchasing power across a regional and a national basis would save tens of billions of dollars over there in those supplies and operations, but you have to have an organized, stable leadership and approach to realize those savings over time. So I think that we try to get them into a better path now, but it'll require a lot of follow-up to achieve those savings.
Can I be really rude, just because I'm down to a minute and 7 seconds?
Yeah.
I'd love to you quickly address the other as well.
Yeah, I was
Okay,
just
yes,
going to
sir.
move
Oh,
to
I'm
that.
sorry. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we're in the same cadence.
Okay, yeah.
All right. Headquarters consolidation at DOD, a lot of money there. What we found was, DOD set a goal to reduce it by 20%, but our question was 20% of what? You really didn't have a good definition, a good baseline figures, so they need to have more figures. They don't have a good accounting for how many contractors they have at DOD, and so we've said, look, if you want to have that goal, you need a better strategy. You got to set a baseline. You got to track it over time. You have to identify what kind of workforce mix you really want in terms of military, civilian, and contract support activities. And so they're focused on trying to improve and gain efficiencies in that area. We're giving them continual advice.
Thank you again for your work, Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two subject areas. Hopefully I can get to both of them, and one of them I don't have great expertise on. I'll offer that to you, and I hope you can respond to it. So in a 2017 GAO report on the DOE and how it deals with nuclear waste, there was a quote that said, tens of billions of dollars by adapting alternative approaches to treat a portion of its low-activity radioactive waste. So most of this is done in two sites, Savannah and Washington. I would just like to know, without trying to go through the details and try to express expertise in a technical matter that I'm not familiar with, is whether the DOE is responding to your suggestions to go with one type rather than the one that is more costly.
Yes. Actually, congressional action will be needed to help them in that area. Congress has acted to allow the waste, the low-level nuclear waste at Savannah River to be treated in a different manner, so they can actually use grout, which is to cement it, basically. At Hanford, everything's to be treated as high level, which means it needs to be vitrified. There's a vitrification approach to turn into glass, basically, and then store it in that way. That's a process that hasn't been perfected, and they're still working on that. Our point, and some of that will need to be done that way at Hanford, but there's this supplemental low-activity waste that they don't really have a strategy for yet, and we think they could use grout to do that. It could save a lot of money, tens of billions of dollars, and it could be done faster. And since Congress set the policy at Hanford, the technologies have improved. We convened expert panels to help us in that area, and so we think Congress should give DOE that flexibility to do that. It'll treat that supplemental low-activity waste faster and cheaper.
And DOE in your discussions is not arguing with your findings?
Mark Gebicke's our expert here.
They have not argued with that. In fact, I think they would like that flexibility to do that. There are 54 million gallons of this waste at Hanford. None of it's been treated. It's spent almost $19 billion so far. Only 5 million of that is high level. And to vitrify it all is not necessary, according to the experts that and we're not experts on all this stuff either, but we convened a National Academies panel, as Mr. Dodaro said, in May of 2016, and they agree that some of the waste could be treated with the grouting mechanism.
So literally they're waiting for congressional
They want that go-ahead because they have a commitment to vitrify about a third to up to a half of the total waste, but the other waste, the supplemental law, they haven't made a decision yet on. They would like that option, the flexibility to go either way.
Okay, and on a totally separate subject, and I know there've been a lot of questions about DOD, but I just wanted to get an understanding of where your role might be in the future. My interest was piqued when we had a hearing with the Business Advisory Group and people who have dealt with DOD oversight on a financial level for a long time. They had McKinsey do a very basic oversight. They identified what they believed $125 billion of waste. So given it's our biggest department, given concerns about procurement that you've talked about, the technical levels of really good investments, but letting the public know the cost benefit for these investments in a world that's changing, and the back of the office things that McKinsey identified. And on top of that, then having the first full audit that the IG is looking at. So the understanding, my concern is, I know your roles are different, but to the degree that you're all responsible for identifying waste and more efficiency, how, as we hopefully get more accountability in the DOD, you see your role being able to support the IG's efforts and the advisory board's efforts?
Well, first of all, with regard to the financial audit, our responsibilities are to audit the financial statements of the federal government. We've created a network across the government where the inspector generals have responsibilities for doing the individual audits. We review their work, we agree on a methodology, we stay in contact with them, and so we use their work to help us make our audit of the overall statements of the federal government. Some parts of the federal government we do ourselves. We do all revenue collection, all the debt, auditing all the debt, which unfortunately is our largest item on our balance sheet. But that's a separate hearing.
If I could interrupt for here.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I'm getting at, is since this is new, this full audit, financial audit,
right,
you will have some responsibility over overseeing that.
Oh, yes,
sure that it's done on the appropriate timeline.
Yes.
And there was best practices asserted in
yes,
that.
yeah. We have regular meetings with the independent auditors that have been hired for the services and with DOD IG. I've met with Glenn Fine, the acting IG. We're very involved. We've got a clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, but GAO definitely has a role to play and responsibilities in that area. On the other business systems in DOD, about 1/3 of our high-risk areas are DOD business practices: weapons systems acquisition, contract management, inventory management, supply chain operations, infrastructure, and we're reviewing their new management approaches. They have a new chief management officer now. That's something we've recommended for years that they put in place. I'm meeting tomorrow with the new person who's been in that area. I've met with the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I've met with all 3 service secretaries. I've met with the controller over there. And so we're very involved in trying to help them achieve some of those savings. On the Defense Business Board, I'm an observer on that board. And so I know what they're doing, and they use a lot of our work to do their studies.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. And we appreciate the depth of expertise that all of our witnesses have. To drill down more on the Hanford versus Savannah River, in your report, this is really the big ticket item. Tens of billions, 40 billion, just kind of doing the math between facilities that might be built, might not be built, processes that occur. Those are huge sums. And so DOE, as I understand it then, has no current authority bound by law. It would take congressional action for them to make a decision on vitrification versus grout. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they have an order where they have treated some waste at other sites through the grouting process. But back in 2002, they were challenged in court, and they sought clarification. So in 2004, the Congress clarified that, yes, they did have that authority for everywhere except Hanford.
Why was it left out?
Because Hanford at that time was not convinced that, the state of Washington, of course, is also a player here, was not convinced that the technology was as good. They had some concerns. For example, DOE did grouting at Rocky Flats outside of Denver, Colorado in early 90s, and it fell apart. In fact, when I first started my career almost 30 years ago. I did some of that work. But they've gotten better at that, and some of the technologies have improved. So we think it's an option. And at Savannah, they have grouted 4 million gallons of the low-level waste successfully, as well as 4 million of the high-level
And not had the legal challenges
and not,
or the
well, they
or
had the
breaking
authority.
parts
Yeah, they had the authority clarified by
early
Congress
on.
in 2004, and they've successfully done that.
I see. So if the committee or others, if we were to take congressional action, then it would need to specifically name Hanford as being on the same par.
It would clarify that for them, yeah.
What legal hurdles do you think that would face?
I don't think there'd be legal hurdles.
Because of the other facilities are using this.
Yeah, right. You already have precedent at the Savannah River. I think, of course, the congressional delegation from Washington needs to be involved in the process, because there are, other perception issues that need to be dealt with there. I think, this evolved with good people making the best decisions at the time and the maturity of the technology at the time. But the maturity of the technology is involved now, so it's a different issue. So I think Congress could take a different approach. One area we added to the high-risk list with the last update was environmental liabilities for the federal government. The reported estimates now to clean up nuclear waste and these other areas are approaching $500 billion. We're spending tens of billions of dollars every year to clean up this activity, but the liability keeps growing as opposed to going down. And so there needs to be risk-based, cost-effective strategies put in place, and that's why we suggested this particular issue at Hanford be revisited.
And I think it's an excellent recommendation. In fact, if this committee were to do nothing else other than save $40 billion in the course of this term, that we would be doing great service to the Republic. With regard to other big-ticket items, $16.2 billion paid in fraudulent EIC payments, $1.7 billion paid in identity theft fraud. It's one thing to have duplication, fragmentation, others, but to pay thieves, calling it improper payments is not only improper, but it's an insult to every single taxpayer that is out there. Can you speak to your earlier recommendations where delays of payments could help buy time to give proper identification and catch these frauds and prevent it? And then you've got those that are saying, oh, no, we can't do that because, we don't want to affect the economy and people want their refunds. Well, as an American taxpayer, I think anyone out there, it's like, hey, would you accept a slight delay in your refund so that, the thief next door is not taking somebody else's money? I think most Americans would be amenable to that. But can you speak to that for a moment?
Oh, sure. Be happy to. First, when identity theft first came on the scene, in addition to the earned income tax credit problem that they have with fraud and abuse, first of all, tax administration has been on our high-risk list since it was created back in the 1990s. So it's been a problem for a long time. Now, what we recommended to the Congress was that the IRS get W-2s from employers earlier in the process. They're processing tax returns in February and March, largely, starting maybe even earlier than that, but they weren't getting the W-2s until April. So the crooks file early.
Sure.
All right.
And January, get the refund, be gone.
Right.
And the actual person files and.
Yeah. So Congress acted on our recommendation. They implemented, the W-2s now come in earlier, except there's still a lot that come in paper form that they can't process quickly enough. So we have recommendations to encourage Congress to mandate more electronic filing of W-2s from employers. Right now, that's threshold set at 250 employees. We think it could be down to 10 to do that area. IRS's own estimates are that they could save $300 million by delaying it a couple weeks to do that. Now, I think and we've suggested Congress or IRS do a cost-benefit analysis and share it with the Congress and see if we could get agreement. Now, I think you could have a phased approach over time that allows them to delay the returns until more electronic information can come in. And then I think over time, if you can get more electronic information in, they get their systems up to date, they won't need the extra time into that approach. So that's kind of what we're looking at.
Well, and we really need to assist in these findings. Your previous recommendations have helped, but we see, as technology advances, that there's a lot of crooks that leverage it. And, the IRS is not the favorite agency of the American public, but, we need to try to help them with the right tools and have the public respond, and Congress certainly needs to take the lead on that. Well, I am out of time for my initial round of questions. I would like to recognize the gentlelady from New York, and then if we have time available, we will go to a couple of additional questions. The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much, and welcome, and thank you for everything the GAO does for the people of America. I want to talk to you about the boat stations of the Coast Guard and your report on them. And the Coast Guard's mandate is to prevent the loss of life, injury, and property damage in the maritime environment through its search and rescue efforts. And it maintains over 200 stations with some combination of boats and helicopters along the U.S. coastline. And we are extremely grateful and appreciative of the hard work and sacrifice of these men and women in the Coast Guard. But this year's report highlights a 217 GAO report on actions needed for the U.S. Coast Guard to close stations that are identified as overlapping and being a duplication. And are you familiar with this report?
I am.
And the GAO found in your report that the Coast Guard had a sound process for analyzing the boat stations, and following this process, the Coast Guard and its contractor wrote, and I quote, that they identified 18 unnecessarily duplicative boat stations with overlapping coverage that could be permanently closed without negatively affecting their ability to meet the 2-hour response and search time. Are you familiar with these findings?
Yes, I am.
And in 2017, GAO reported that the Coast Guard's leadership still believed that these findings were valid. Is that true?
Yes.
And so closing the unnecessary duplication of stations could save up to $290 million, they say. That's a lot of money over 30 years. So, Mr. Dodaro, if that is true, then why are these duplicative stations still open?
Yeah, there's been some resistance from the local communities, and there's been some resistance in the Congress as a result of that, and so far, and that's prevented it from being closed so far. Now, the one thing I'd want to point out, in addition to the savings, there's an important operational aspect that the Coast Guard points out, and that is the fact that because of some of these stations aren't as actively busy, people aren't getting the training necessary to stay up to speed. Now, we raised this issue at the Navy about not adequately having time for training, and as a result, partly as a result of that, they had some accidents with their operations over time, and so they need to have proper training. So to me, this is not only saving money, but allowing the Coast Guard people, who we have great respect for as well, allow their people to get proper training. So I would encourage the Congress to allow the closure of these stations.
Well, I had one closed in my district. Of course, no one liked to see it closed. It was, a popular service that was in the district I'm privileged to represent, but we closed it because it was no longer needed. And so we haven't closed any of these since 1988. What are the obstacles that stop these things from being closed?
I'll ask George Scott, our expert in this area, to address that, Congresswoman.
Thank you. As we reported last year, the Coast Guard has a sound, rigorous process for identifying which stations to close. Since 1973, they've made 8 attempts to close a series of stations. And as Comptroller Dodaro pointed out, in each instance, either there's been opposition at the local level and/or congressional intervention, which has prevented Coast Guard from following through on making the closures. One of the points we make, and as Gene made as well, it's not just about saving money, but there's also operational impacts. For example, Coast Guard spent over $2 million to repair a station a few years ago, damaged by Hurricane Sandy, that was on the closure list. And so again, in addition to diverting resources from existing stations, we're actually spending money that we wouldn't have to spend if they were allowed to move forward with closing the stations. I actually sort of view this as a good news story. If Congress does nothing, no action is actually needed, then the Coast Guard could actually follow through with its plan to move forward with closing these stations. And we also made recommendations for Coast Guard to, once they have a plan in place with timeframes to close these stations, that they also turn their attention to some air stations, where there's also some potential duplication and overlap in air stations. They're not quite as far along in their process yet, but I think sort of allowing them to move forward with this first round of closures will really set the stage for them to then follow through with potential analysis of closing duplicative air stations as well.
This seems ridiculous that they've identified unnecessary facilities that are costing $260 million. And I remember when we had this problem with the military bases, we had a bipartisan effort where we did a bill that once the commission came back and said that these bases had to be closed, Congress no longer had a role in it. It had to be closed, and maybe that's what we have to do here. Everybody's going to fight for services that are in their community. That's our job. So if they're trying to close something in a community, it's jobs, it's activity, it's economic activity in the area, it's going to be fought tooth and nail by members of Congress. So I respectfully request the chairman to look at the base closing bill and see if maybe we need to do the same thing with the Coast Guard stations, because we're incapable of closing something that has been there for a number of years and people like, even though it's not needed, unnecessary, and is wasting taxpayers' funds, especially when you say they're being repaired when they're not even being used. It's sort of ridiculous. Anyway, my time is up, and I thank you for yielding to me, and thank you very much. Good to see you again.
Gentlelady yields back, and Chair now recognizes Mr. Palmer for some follow-on.
I'll be brief. In the supplemental security income, 40%, you identify a 40% increase in individuals under age 18. Is there any insight into the cause of this increase?
Yes. You want to put it in? Let's put it in. Yeah. Let's tell them we want it. Okay.
I believe most of the increase, or a big part of it, has been in children. Go ahead, Barb. The question was about the 40% increase in Social Security SSI population benefits, and what's driving the increase?
Supplemental security income, you've got a 40% increase in the number of children who 14 to 17, I think, 14 to 18. Yeah. Any insight into why we had that increase? What are people claiming they're qualified for?
Well, we're confirming their qualification.
Right.
That's not just applications. That's how many people have come on the rolls. So there are more children with disabilities. We think that increasingly people are better able to recognize what may be happening with their child.
So it's better diagnostic techniques.
Yes, and you know, when they're in school, for example, there's the disability program in public schools where schools are required to pay attention and to identify children with disabilities. So I think there's a greater sensitivity.
Okay. On the earned income tax credit, do you think delaying the, you talked about delaying the payment of for a couple of weeks. Do you think that would help with reducing the improper payments? I think $16 billion in improper payments on their earned income tax
I think it could, because it could allow more time for the auditing to be done. They can increase the auditing for the earned income tax credits as well. You know, what we're suggesting is you could delay them for everybody, all the type of returns.
Yeah, you don't want to single anybody out.
Right, right. But while you're doing that, you could audit more of the EITC returns and hopefully, identify additional ones that should not be paid. So it could help with the improper payments in EITC as well as prevent identity theft.
All right, and my last question is on Medicare Advantage. GAO made 5 recommendations, 9 of which have been implemented, including 1 priority recommendation. Has there been any communication between Medicare and GAO on that, and any explanation for why they have not implemented these recommendations, particularly the 1 priority recommendation?
Yeah, I've met with Seema Vera, who's the administrator for Center for Medicaid and Medicare Studies. I met with Secretary Price before he left, and I'm going to meet with the new secretary as well. We're now meeting on a quarterly basis with them to go over all open recommendations in GAO. Ms. Nikki Clowers can give them a bit more specific update.
Let me just ask this. If those recommendations were implemented, how would it have any impact on reducing the improper payments? I think it's $14 billion in improper payments.
It would certainly result in cost savings. We estimate billions of dollars each year if they would fully implement our recommendations on the Medicare Advantage payments, which is really the coding. They need a better adjustment between what they pay in Medicare fee-for-services and making coding adjustments when they translate to the payments under Medicare Advantage. They've taken some steps in making those adjustments, but we think the adjustments are still too low. And if they got better data, more updated data to help make those coding adjustments, they'll make significant savings.
And my last question on that, is this an issue of antiquated data systems, or is it, I don't understand why, when particularly one of them's a priority, that they haven't acted on this, and again, considering the magnitude of savings that could be achieved.
Yeah, no, it just causes them to, there's no limitation on it. And we did it. You just need to get updated information. It's just they don't want to change the process that they have had in place, is my feeling. We're trying to continue to persuade them that they need to change, and that it will result in billions of savings.
I was afraid that would be the answer. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for indulging me another round of questions.
No, I appreciate the questions, and the gentleman yields back. I want to thank the witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for your great work. And I also want to point out for the record, you lead by example. In a conversation that we had prior to this hearing, you had mentioned a figure of money that you turned back to the government. And what was that figure?
Last year, as a result of our work and Congress's actions on it in the executive branch, over $73 billion in financial benefits occurred. That's $128 back for every dollar invested in GAO.
Yeah, so, this shows government the way it should function and the way it should work. And I thoroughly believe if we doubled the size of our auditors and doubled the size of our inspectors general, we could get at a lot of the country's problems right there. But as has been pointed out in this hearing, we have a responsibility to act, or in the case of maybe the Coast Guard, to not act if they have authorities already. But I think it does mention something that's also been raised in this hearing by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, that it's probably incumbent upon us to do more of a touch. What we see is the GAO and the Department of the IG, they reach out continually, but it's probably incumbent upon us to do more of a touch in a line of action. And you've certainly given us some crucial areas today where we could take some action in a bipartisan fashion to get at many of these problems. And I'm very grateful for all of the hard work that each of you do. A lot of times it's thankless work, it's unadvertised, but it shows true public servants to our great country. And so I'm very, very grateful to each of you for the work that you do. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. And if there is no further business without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.